I'm excited for this panel and this opportunity to share some of these findings, and want to thank CGD for this opportunity, the working group, but also Julia Kaufman and Janine Madden-Keller for really helping to shape this paper. And also a big thank you to the partnership leads and experts who took time out of their kind of busy schedules to speak with me, and for whom I really, got the sense that this topic and conversation around partnerships was sort of near and dear to their hearts. So just quickly in terms of how I've structured my presentation is I'll give a kind of a brief overview of the paper itself, just to provide some context. I'll share some observations and then some ideas to take forward that have emerged from the paper. And I'll keep sort of the presentation at a high level, and we'll save the discussion of specific examples and cases for our panel discussion later on. So I think as Ruth noted, the paper aims to explore sort of evidence to policy partnerships really as a one kind of tool or a mechanism for strengthening the demand for and use of evaluation evidence and decision making. And if you bring sort of a systems lens to this, like the demand side really is about strengthening capacity, at all levels of the knowledge system, right? It's the individual policymaker level, it's organizational supports and systems, but it's also institutional sort of norms and mandates. And the paper follows on the heels of a 2020 UNU wider paper that, as Ruth also alluded to, reviews the progress of development partners in generating and using evaluation evidence. And while the paper found that we're making progress in the quality and number of impact evaluations, the authors pretty clearly conclude that we need to do more work to ensure evaluation findings and recommendations are used in policy and practice decisions. And I think two of the report's findings in particular were relevant to this paper. The first, that donor financed and commissioned evaluations, and those led primarily by investigators who are from the North, underplay the need for local ownership. And the second, that development partners place limited emphasis, on strengthening country level capacity to produce and use evaluations, right? So in a sense, the paper offers these evidence to policy partnerships, as one way to address some of the challenges raised in that report. And what I wanted to do with this paper is call attention to to highlight the value of partnerships in advancing evidence use, right? Because to invest in partnerships, we first have to see them and understand their value. And while, the importance of partnerships and relationships may seem obvious to most, right? The absence of partnerships or a lack of engagement between researchers and policymakers is among the most cited barriers to evidence use in the literature. What I found through my conversations and research is that we aren't investing in partnerships in a way that acknowledges their importance. So there is an opportunity here to sort of rethink how we invest in them and structure them. So how, as I get at, try to get at the paper is by exploring sort of barriers and enablers, the incentives for partnerships, and by digging deeply to understand partnership dynamics and what makes for an effective partnership. So before proceeding further, I want to offer sort of the definition for partnerships as used in the paper. So we define evidence to policy partnerships as spaces that allow for interaction and systematic collaboration between evidence producers and decision makers to inform policy and practice decisions, right? As distinct from one-off engagements, databases or portals, in that they are structures, they are kind of a fora, a platform that are designed to support ongoing collaboration and communication, right? So it's a program, it's an institution, it's a network, it's a community. A partnership is not the policy engagement workshop that you might have at the start, the middle, or end of your research project to ensure that your findings are taken up. Right? So I just wanted to offer that definition. And the motivation for partnerships reviewed in the paper tends to be threefold, right? It's, first, to foster collaborative and co-creative research to improve access to evidence, and improve the likelihood that findings are used, right? Again, this is in contrast to research that is conducted, based on a researcher or a development partner's understanding of priorities without true consultation. It's to create processes for systematic use of evidence, right? Where there is a commitment to strengthening capabilities and structures for evidence use. And third, it's to build credibility and transparency in the policy process, right? Through a sharing of data and findings, whether good or bad, right? And creating a space to dialogue and debate this. And all of this, with the ultimate aim of giving evidence a more prominent role in policy and program and implementation decisions. I think that most people would agree on the value of or importance of partnerships, at least those of us working in the evidence space and evidence community, and even consider it obvious, as I noted earlier. I think at the most basic level, through these partnerships, governments can gain access to evidence and specialized expertise and research methods. And researchers and funding partners in turn, right, can benefit from the insights that they gain about policy windows, right, and the access to, data sets, administrative data sets, and other kinds of data to help answer research questions. But as I note in the paper, right, partnerships can only really play a role in strengthening the use of evidence, when the incentives or motives for engaging in the partnership are aligned across all of the relevant partners, whether government, research or academic partners or funding partners. And I've listed a few areas where there can be misaligned incentives. I won't speak to all of them, but maybe I'll just highlight a few, right? So incentives can be misaligned when there isn't enough of a commitment to ensuring, partner priorities are centered. And I think, we haven't been great at this as a development community, but things are starting to shift. And there are many promising partnership approaches that demonstrate this in the paper. You can have, misalignment when program budgets and timelines don't do enough to support the relationship building aspect of a partnership, right? So you have budgets that are too small or not flexible enough, and timelines that might be too rigid or too short. Incentives can also be misaligned when the capacity needed at all levels of the knowledge system, as I noted earlier, to influence evidence use isn't sufficient enough, right? So research is challenged when you don't have basic data infrastructure in place, for example, right? And decision maker ability to engage with evidence is also challenged in the absence of organizational supports and institutional norms and mandates. So moving next quickly to kind of a few key observations and partnerships approaches that correlate with these observations. I won't, again, get into specific examples, but kind of welcome everybody to read through these and to engage with the paper and invite continued discussion and dialogue there. But I'll just sort of mainly speak to some of the key observations, right? The first is that, what I want to highlight is that, partnerships are successful when they are built on strong relationships, right? And yes, policymakers are after findings, but they also want to be consulted and to actively engage in setting priorities, in co-defining research agendas, and in reviewing findings, right? And this is equally important to them. Again, this is, quite different from, the more passive communication and dissemination or policy advocacy approaches that many development programs still, I think, support. And from a researcher perspective, I think if you're working towards effective use of evidence, decision makers, as I just noted, don't want you to just show up with the research and your findings, right? You too need an engagement strategy and to form alliances that will help you understand priorities, the policy process and the context in which you are working, to identify windows of opportunity, right? And to also assess the capabilities that exist for the evidence that you are generating to be taken up and to influence policy and practice decisions, right? And as we know, I think true, collaboration and partnerships are built on trust, and it takes time to build that trust. And so the ideas that I offer for taking forward are aimed at getting at, what it might take to formally value and invest in the relationship building aspects of policy work. So the next sort of key observation is that, convening power is critical. For partnerships to be effective, they have to have convening power. And this is more than just, hosting a meeting. It's creating a space for dialogue and having the ability to ensure that, the right people are at the table as policies are debated and decided on, right? And, some ways in which partnerships are doing this sort of at a high level is they're creating neutral spaces for ongoing dialogue, like the Utafiti Sera initiative led by Tasker, and they are facilitating collaborative learning networks and hosting policy dialogues. The third key observation is that capacity strengthening is an important dimension of partnerships, right? And most of the partnerships that I reviewed in the paper do in fact have a capacity strengthening component that typically includes sort of workshops and tools to improve the design and implementation of evaluation. So, training and support for both people in government, but also for researchers, and also workshops and trainings on the demand or use side, right, to improve the uptake and use of those findings. But here I would argue that this isn't sufficient, and there is it isn't sufficient across the partnerships that I reviewed, and there is tension between sort of the focus on generating results, right, and influencing policy in the near term versus sort of long-term capacity support and systems level needs, right, to strengthen evidence use. And the final thing I'll say about this is that you can't, I think it's hard to have this conversation about, strengthening evidence use without really addressing very real capacity constraints, both on the supply and the demand side. And this isn't just like an issue in low and middle income countries. It's an issue, I think, that all countries face and experience. And so the third observation is that misaligned incentives slow progress. And I touched a bit already on where there can be misaligned incentives, and just some quick approaches for how sort of partnerships are addressing these, right? It's by embedding sort of long-term partnerships to work alongside government and deepen an understanding of local context, right? So in the paper, I give the example of ID Insight's work with the Ministry of Monitoring and Evaluation in Ghana, where they are working to sort of flexibly support the government's evaluation needs, right? And coming to the table with different tools and trying to kind of be adaptive in how they are addressing sort of the challenges that the government is facing. It's by investing in personal relationships to develop an understanding of government priorities, right? And to gain access to information about reform priorities, right? In one of the partnerships that I reviewed, the Transfer Project, there's mention of really the time that, the partnership really spends on getting to know at an individual level, government partners and counterparts, really to build those relationships. It's introducing requirements to ensure that research is decided on and designed with practitioners, as EGAP, or the Evidence in Governance and Politics Initiative, is doing. And so moving next quickly to some of the ideas to take forward that emerged from the paper. The first is to anchor evidence to policy efforts in country-level institutional structures, like evaluation units or policy labs. And why I think the argument here is that country-level institutional structures have access to senior leadership and decision-making processes. They have wide reach across government, and entering through these institutions could help anchor the focus on country-led evaluation agendas, right? But here I think it's important to think through how best to complement or partner with existing initiatives, so that as development partners, we have a way of easily identifying, what these initiatives are, where there may be a need for additional support, and what different partners bring to the table. The second idea to take forward is to prioritize capacity strengthening, right, in our efforts to advance evidence use, and to do it in a way that begins to challenge power imbalances. And for example, right, by really focusing on building a body of country evaluation experts, right, to stem what has been, a kind of a traditional kind of one-directional flow of expertise. And I've highlighted a few capacity development models in the paper that are trying to do this. I think this also responds to growing acknowledgement in the development community that it's the country level researchers and advisors with a close understanding of context, the context in which they live and work, that are best positioned to facilitate policy engagement, right? And another point I want to make about sort of the power imbalances is about the authorship of impact evaluation-based papers, and the important questions we need to not only kind of interrogate, but to act on, right? Like, what research is prioritized? How is it prioritized, and who prioritizes it, right? And here, just as an aside, I had a conversation with a research partner this week who was describing their research to me and said, I led, I designed, I did everything here, but I could not be listed as first or last author because the funding was external, right? So I think there's a real problem there that we need to not only begin to sort of interrogate, but really to start to act on. The third idea to take forward is to strengthen, coordination of evidence to policy partnerships. I think it goes without saying that the development community and partners, we just need more coordination, right? And so one idea here is to really consider a formal structure for coordinating partners that are working with government on impact evaluations, right? And the partnerships to promote evidence use. So one example I give in the paper is the kind of local education group structure, where that brings together national governments and representatives from education, development partners, donors, teacher associations, civil society, to help set kind of priorities and to coordinate the kind of education initiatives in that sector. The fourth idea to take forward is kind of to think through, how we might change funding structures to support long-term partnerships. And this, speaks to the point I made earlier about, program budgets that, are too small or inflexible, and timelines that may be too short or too rigid, and that as a result don't accommodate, the relationship building aspects of partnerships, right? So the suggestions I offer here kind of really are aimed at valuing partnerships and giving them sort of the space and the resources that they need to grow, and really kind of acknowledging them as critical elements of the policy process, right? And I think to systematically promote co-creation, and do it in a way that allows for kind of iterative co-production cycles, that is just more than a start of a project performative kind of tick box exercise. We have to invest in this, right? And so some ideas here are to consider allocating a percentage of project budgets to partnership building work where relevant, and make it a routine cost, like overhead or administrative costs, right? The second idea is to just build more flexibility into budgets, right? To move away from those rigid output-focused indicators to allow grantees to more flexibly respond to partner needs and policy windows as they arise. The third idea is to fund projects just for longer timeframes to accommodate the complexities of systems change. I mean, we know policymaking is far from a predictable or a linear process, right? So we should think about funding in a way, I think, that acknowledges kind of what we understand about the policy process. And then the final idea gets at, I think what needs to happen kind of next in terms of how we understand and measure the impact of evidence to policy partnerships. So, what it means to embed evidence use in decision making, right, to make evidence use the norm, but specifically the contributions that partnerships make to this, right, and then trying to understand, kind of to unpack, which partnership models might be best suited for which policy questions and which contexts.